Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming tonight. This is something that really is to me important because I speak a lot, and I can remember when I started speaking about 25 years ago, I don't think I told a story. I told facts and I had a few anecdotes, but the story wasn't really a feature of the way I spoke. And one day I think I was speaking in Glasgow, and I decided to tell something about my own story. And it was astonishing, the difference in the mood of the audience and the number of people that came up to me afterwards and wanted to talk to me. It was just a different dynamic. And I've discovered since that stories are extraordinarily important for anyone who's presenting, speaking. And I think now the human voice is once again found an amazing power. When you think about, TikTok, think about LinkedIn, you think about YouTube, Instagram. The world is going through a tremendous evolution just now, a stage in its evolution, when really speaking, the speaking voice, the human voice, has become all powerful again. I remember being told that the Prime Minister, William Gladstone, who stood in Midlothian, just outside Edinburgh, well, it's actually, Midlothian is Edinburgh and its surrounding area, and he spoke at a place called Waverley Market. This is the end of the 19th century, and he had the place packed with people standing, and he spoke for 4.5 hours. Now, when you think how the concentration span has changed since then, the idea of standing up and listening to someone for 4.5 hours is very hard to imagine now, isn't it? Unless you're a Donald Trump supporter, and he does speak for quite a long time, doesn't he? So maybe that's coming back as well. But the central point here is stories are important. Why is that? Because whole humanity is rooted in stories. When you think about it, we are still hearing stories from 6,000 years ago. And if you go to some parts of the world, you will see stories on walls, painted in pictures or written in different scripts. So the story has always been there. It's not something new, it's not a revelation, but boy, it's important. And the reason is that when you're speaking to an audience and you tell stories, you are suddenly building a different kind of trust for them. You're opening up something, and people will listen to stories, we're hardwired to listen to stories from being a little child. And it's the rhythm of the voice, it's the tone of the voice, it's the unexpected. There's something exciting about a story because it engages emotions. And while we might take something into our brain, the logical side of our mind, and we might rationalize it, it is the emotional reasoning that really counts when you listen to someone speak. So that's why I use stories. And I have seen over the years how many people recall stories that you use. So that's another thing. It's the memory. People will remember stories, but you tell them a fact or a figure and they'll forget it, unless it's a really striking fact, something that's just beyond this world. They'll remember stories though. And even if that story has got a number in it, they'll remember that. So that's why stories have become so important. And there are some people who use formulas. I mean, the greatest storytellers, obviously there's fiction writers, and I read a lot of fiction because fiction is a different way of learning. Because you're in someone else's world. It's like you're living someone else's life. And at the same time, you're getting all these references. You're getting, information about the rest of the world. You're getting information about, what a forest looks like and feels like. And it tells you that when you're telling a story, those things really matter. It's creating some sort of sensory environment for people. So if I say, for example, yesterday I took a walk down the water of Leith, that's a reference here, and I talk about, seeing a kingfisher and then a heron and the soft sound of the water just gently lapping against both sides of the shore, you begin to get an impression. You talk about it being a warm, sunny day, and then you get another impression. And you talk about the sounds and the smells, the smell of honeysuckle, the smell of wild garlic, and you begin to build a picture. So that's what great stories do. And that's why I love fiction. You don't get this in non-fiction. The stories tend to be much better. They tend to be very purposeful. But of course, every story I tell as a speaker is purposeful. So let's look at that. Let's see how Disney structures it. Now, Disney and Pixar have got the same pattern to all their films. Think about it. There's a hero. There's a conflict. There are failed attempts to solve that conflict. There's backup plans. Then there's a breakthrough, a solution that works, and then you've got a conclusion. And the hero is back where he or she or it was, but with new powers and knowledge. That sums up, or you think about it, Disney films have all got this same theme, and it's like a circle. And it's brilliant because, people remember Disney stories. So if you can, please mute. So that is the essence of the story. It has a very strong meaning. It's memorable and it's descriptive. So why do I use stories? I use them because they do what other information provision does not do. And there's no greater example than the post office scandal, which we've seen in this country, where 900 postmasters and postmistresses were prosecuted for stealing from the company. But it turns out that it was a software provided by Fujitsu called Horizon that was the fault. It was giving wrong information. And no one at the post office even considered that having one person a month being prosecuted because of stealing money from the post office just after this software system was installed. No one saw that that was a suspicion, that there might be something wrong with the software. So they all lost their jobs. And these were businesses, remember, for people. It's like a franchise, isn't it, the post office? There were humiliations that you cannot even imagine, because these post offices tend to be in small communities, and people's reputations were ruined. Some had to move away. They lost money. Some were put in jail. Quite a few were put in jail because all they had to do was to admit they were guilty, which they weren't, and then it would all go away. And some went to jail. Many died. Stress was enormous. And one committed suicide. Now, this has been going on for years. And it's been headline news on quite a few occasions. But somehow it didn't really register with the British people. They'd heard of the post office scandal, but it didn't mean very much to them. And then, I think it was earlier this year, they did a dramatisation of this with the people who were involved. The guy that led the fight against the post office as a kind of central character. And suddenly, it is the biggest news story. It's actually a massive scandal, but it hadn't bothered the politicians to that extent until this programme came out. And suddenly, the country was up in arms, and you found out the hurt, the damage that had been inflicted on these people. So that suddenly became an urgency for the government and the post office to do something about it. The post office had set aside a large sum of money, But most of that money was used in legal costs. I mean, it goes on and on and on, and it still hasn't been resolved. But it is now in the public consciousness. And I think it won an award at a recent television. And it reminded me that back in 1966, boy, I was young, but I was around. In fact, I was 16. And we had a wee black and white television, which we'd only had for 3 years. And there was a play, it was a dramatisation on called Cathy Come Home. And if anyone remembers Cathy Come Home, it was about a woman, a young family that were evicted from their home and they were homeless. And it suddenly brought to the nation this notion of people being homeless, being out in the streets. And it's appalled us. It appalled people. And from that came the charity Shelter, which has been around ever since, and other charities as well. And suddenly they were talking about it in Parliament. So homelessness became a big issue. And at that time, of course, there was more social housing and more council homes. So it was easier to deal with it. Now the problem is bigger than that. And we've got 148,000 children who are registered homeless. And you'll see stories on the news channels of these young families that have been put into a small room. They're put somewhere, and in a way they're forgotten, sometimes crammed into tiny spaces. Sometimes the accommodation is barely fit for human habitation. And they're left with no choice but to sit and wait for something to happen. See, it doesn't say enough, does it? But if I tell you about one family in Middlesbrough, a mother with 2 children. There was Sammy, who was aged 11, and his little sister Bridget. The mother was Margaret. And they found themselves homeless, and they were put into this tiny room in a bed and breakfast. But the bed and breakfast had ceased to function as a bed and breakfast. It was now just accommodation. They were getting paid quite a lot of money by the government to let these rooms. And little Sammy, aged 11, was so good. He loved school in his old home. He loved it. He'd come home and he'd want to do something. He'd want to learn more. And he was really attentive. But once he'd been in that home for 3 months, he began to deteriorate. His attention span went. He had a worried expression. And one day he was out shopping. And, well, not shopping, he was out walking. And he saw a group of young guys, older than him, running out the shops with all their goods piled up, obviously taken without permission, stolen. So little Sammy goes into the shop and he sees a fruit loaf, and he picks it up and he's walking out the door, trying to look surreptitious. And the shop owner said, "Hey, wait a minute." So he sits Sammy down and Sammy tells him why he stole the fruit loaf, why he stole it. And he said, "I want you to tell your mother about this. That's all I ask of you. And here's some butter to go with the fruit loaf." So Sammy goes back, he has to confess to his mother. She is mortified. And she takes him immediately back to the shop. She has to bring the little girl. And she says to the shopkeeper, "I am so ashamed." And he said, "Don't be. He did this for you," said the shopkeeper. He is 11-year-old. He's worried about you. That's his big worry, and his little sister. So the shopkeeper says, "Well, as it happens, I've got a flat, 2 doors along, and it's empty. And you can have it." So that story was a circular one. And if Sammy hadn't stolen that fruit loaf, it would never have happened. So it started with something that was seen by many as a malign activity and ended with a really positive story. But homelessness is not fun. I experienced it. And there is one story I tell about being homeless, which really cuts to the reasons that I do what I do. And it was that, one night it was very, very cold. It was in Piccadilly Circus. And this van drew up. And I'm thinking, oh, what's this? And this woman climbs out the van and a guy gets out and I say, look, we're from a charity and we could take you to a hostel tonight. And in the morning, we can try and help you find some accommodation. So I said, oh, that's brilliant. So I got into this van and was taken to this hostel. As soon as I arrived there, I was handed over to the people in the hostel. Then the driver and this woman went away and said, good luck, Mike. I went into the hostel, shown into a tiled room, and I was told to take my clothes off, which I did. The next thing I know, there's a hose pointed at me and unleashed. And I felt so humiliated by that. I went back into the streets, because at least there I felt I had some dignity. So this taught me a vital lesson. And when you're telling stories that tell you lessons, it makes them very powerful. It taught me that, it wasn't what was said to me, it was what wasn't said to me. And people who are in difficulty like that, it doesn't mean they should just become part of a process. Only peas should be processed. And anyway, I escaped back into the streets and I wanted simply to have meaning. I wanted to feel that I was valued, I was significant. And I didn't. In fact, I felt quite the reverse. So I went back into the streets. It made me realise that all these interactions we have, we can either lift people's spirits or sink them. And sometimes sink them in a humiliating way. Being homeless doesn't make you useless. The words are entirely different. So it was an extraordinary experience because it was a lesson that I'll never, ever forget. And it changed my life. Because from that day on, I wanted to be someone who was cheerful, someone who look in people's eyes and smile and say positive things. And by and large, I've done that. I've made a few howlers in my life. I'm not going to deny that. But by and large, the better you treat people, the better they'll treat you. But it's more than that. People need to feel valued and significant. They're like the baseline. Is someone's microphone on? Just getting a bit of background noise. Anyway, so that's how a story can tell something quite significant. That was a personal story. But strangely enough, what got me out of being homeless was not a charity that's there to help homeless people. It was the police who persisted in arresting people, not just for being homeless, but being, offenders, a scar on the landscape. And I was picked up by the police one night and I was taken into West End Central Police Station and I was put in the cell, and in the morning, before I left, the police sergeant said to me, he says, Michael, we don't want to see you back here. And I said, well, that makes two of us. He says, so before you go, what are your dreams? And no one's ever asked me what my dreams were. You don't think you're entitled to dreams, in fact, when you're out in the streets. And he persisted. I said, well, I want to get a home, somewhere to stay, and a job to pay for it. And he said, they're not your dreams, they're your next steps. This is a policeman. Now, the reason I told that story is that I spoke at a police conference down in England a couple of years ago, and I told this story. And the Chief Constable of South Yorkshire, who was the host of this, every police force apart from the Met was there from England and Wales. And it was a great couple of days. I loved it. So I was the last speaker. And the Chief Constable stood up and he said, that story, because I did tell this sergeant, My dreams were to do well in music and to one day own my own business, start a business. And both came true, in fact. Ended up in Dublin busking, just a few months later. And then I started a business in 1993. So that was a powerful thing for me, because he said, when I went, he said, right, go with a spring in your step, start making it happen in all your actions, in all your deeds, in all your thoughts. And that worked for me. So the police were really enthralled by this story, because I had people coming up to me and saying, your story's changed my life. Because I talk to a lot of guys and we never say, what are your dreams? Can you see the difference that story makes? It's astonishing, isn't it? That you can do something to people's minds. You can inspire people to think a different way, to do things differently. And that's exactly what's happened. It suddenly became a message that went out to police forces saying, we've got to start engaging with people in a different way. And he told this story, and it went round the police forces in England and Wales. And in fact, the Violence Reduction Unit in Glasgow, which is across Scotland now, works in the same principle. Don't ask people not to come back. Ask them what they would do if they could start their life all over again. And they'll tell you. And suddenly you reach a different emotional part of them, because everything else is defensive, isn't it? If you're a criminal, if you're treated as a criminal, if you're a violent criminal, if you're treated as a violent criminal, you will stay a violent criminal, and you will treat people in the way that a violent criminal might react, angrily. So they've done that too. And I've shared a stage with a guy called Callum Henderson, who, his last incident, he was stabbed in the neck 9 times. But he'd been a perpetrator many times before. And he ended up in the violence in a hospital bed. And someone from the Violence Reduction Unit arrives at his desk in a coloured t-shirt and says, Callum, come on, what would you like to look back in your life and say or think that would be a success? He said, I just want my wee boy to be proud of me. His wee boy was 2, and so his father stabbed in the neck. Anyway, Callum Henderson is now a leader. He's a leader in Braveheart Enterprises, which is the social enterprise that the police, the Violence Reduction Unit, have set up. And you get him introduced on stage by a chief superintendent of the police saying, I'd like to welcome on stage my friend, my colleague, Callum Henderson. Callum comes up and he's one of the most compelling speakers, because he's talking about his life and how that turned around. And he talks about going into this chief constable's office, and there's a cherry top desk, and he's never been into like this before, and he's offered a cup of tea in a proper cup, and he said he felt so intimidated until the chief constable came round and says, Callum, I'm pleased to meet you, pal. Delighted to meet you. Let's have a chat and a cup of tea, and let's plan some things together. That changed his life. So that's a story about a story that changes people's lives. And so, in a sense, the story tells something that no other mechanism can. No other mechanism can do that. And I've tried. You can imagine a work of fiction with all the kind of details stripped out of it, can't you? Just this happened, like bullet points and dates. Eventually Polly marries Jack and they live happily ever after. That would be a rotten story, wouldn't it? So that's what a speech really means. It's about giving people information. Yes, of course. But information on its own does not hold. It doesn't captivate people. And that's why I do what I do. I mean, I tell so many stories now. I would say that my speeches are stories, just a succession of stories with Lincoln. And some of them are funny. You know, I said recently that I was painting my bedside table pink. No comments on that, right? I'm very with it, very together. Not afraid of my feminine side. Anyway, the next day I was going up to see my sister, and I got on the tram, and this little girl sitting opposite me with her mother, she said, "Do you wear pink nail varnish?" And I looked, and I saw a little scraping of pink left on my nail. And I said, "Yes, I haven't managed to take it all off today." And she says, "You'd suit green better." That was extraordinary. That's children. Children fascinate me because children just do the unexpected. They pick up on things that no one else picks up on. You know, suddenly a little 3-year-old who you've never met before will lean across and say, "When's your birthday?" "My birthday's tomorrow." And you start this conversation. It's wonderful. And when you remove that ability from children to be free and open and tell stories like that, you remove something really quite important, because children start telling stories as soon as they can speak. And it is just part of us. And I say this because I've seen lots of speeches. I've seen political speeches. I've seen, professorial speeches, or they call them lectures. I've been at lots of conferences where people will speak and there's still a tendency to talk facts. Does that make sense? So it's about information, it's about informing people. When I say, don't just inform them, inspire them. So that's why I use the story, like all the time. And I'll give you a couple of other examples of stories that I regularly use to make a point. And one of them is about the Scottish tendency to, talk ourselves down a bit. We don't like tall poppies. We're a bit dour sometimes. Or we're very funny, quite gregarious. But at home, Scots tend to, think of the worst rather than the best that's about to happen. Sadly. But there was a great story of a linguistics professor at Ontario University, and he's talking about language and social linguistics and how in some languages a double negative can mean a positive. And I suppose the Scots not bad would be included in that, wouldn't it? It's a double negative and it means aye, it's good. In America they would say awesome to mean the same thing, but in Scotland we say not bad. But anyway, he's talking about these languages, saying there's some in a positive and a negative, can be a positive or a negative. He said, but it's no language where a double positive can be a negative. And the Scottish people said, aye, right. Just a brilliant illustration, isn't it, of how language works. And it kind of feeds back to people that language really does matter and how language comes across. See, I'm fascinated by words. And when you listen to what people say, you pick up so much in buses, in conversations that you have with people that you've never met, sitting in bars, just listening to people talk to each other. I'm a terrible eavesdropper. In fact, I make it a lifetime habit. I go out and I talk to strangers in the appropriate way, because you learn so much from people. Little snippets, little things that you hear people say that either make people laugh or they make them think about something that's really quite, important in the world. So let's think of a couple. I remember being on a bus in Glasgow, and I'd only been in the city for 3 days. This was in 1984. and they just privatised the buses. They deregulated them. And there are all these different companies taking on routes that have been, all the councils, the corporations transport. And now there were different colour buses, and I was standing in Sakio Street, and I was going to McDonald's, and a bottle of wine in a bag, and I was going to dine with this lady that invited me. And I'm looking at the front of the buses, and there's one that says Shawlands on the front. I said, that's the one for me. I get on, and this bus seemed to be taking ages and ages. And we're going through a dimly lit street in Govan, which is a wee bit off the way if you were taking a direct route. And there was an old guy got on to the bus, and he said, where the hell have you been? And the bus driver says, I'm sorry, my friend, it's we're all on new routes and it's confusing and we haven't got our timings quite right and all the rest of it. And the guy says, that's no excuse. He says, that's terrible. I've been held up there for a long time. So he starts moving up the bus. And the bus driver obviously thinks, you don't get to be that easily. He says, excuse me, pal, are you a pensioner? He said, I wasn't a pensioner when I started waiting for this bus. Bloody well am now. Genius. See, I love little stories like that. They tell you about the richness of people and the richness of life around her. I love, particularly when I'm speaking outside Scotland, I love talking about the things I've heard in Scotland, and they get audiences outside Scotland in hysterics because they are really funny. So humour is important, but stories are important generally. And if you tell a funny story, all the better. The funny story can't be too long in a speech, because that's getting into the old shaggy dog story. No, they've got to be very brief. And our stories have got to be brief as well, but you can make a story brief because you might, fragment it into different bits. So someone else has joined us halfway through, but that's good. It's good. Because I will, also do a summary towards the end. But stories, where was I? Yes, they can't be too long. And they have to have a surprise element in it. Okay? Just a surprise element so that there's a bit of a revelation, bit of an ending. Like the policeman talking to me. Outside the police cells. The longest stories I've told are about people that have really changed the trajectory of where they are. People that have made dramatic, big changes. And the first one I told, which went down an absolute storm, was at a housing conference in Glasgow. This is years ago. And I talked about this guy who I'd met and I'd actually phoned up and spoken to. He was Mayor Jaime Lerner, who was an architect who stood for mayor in the city of Curitiba in southern Brazil. And he set about transforming the city. Not with a range of policies, with a simple proposition, a simple vision, a city designed for people. No one objected to that. Who would? A city designed for people? If he'd approached it in a way of reducing carbon emissions, getting cars off the road, people would have objected. You've seen here how ULEZ has, got car drivers up in arms, and it's created big rifts in communities, and the government are seen as having inflicted something, imposed something on people that they didn't want, and not doing it, at the right timings, and making it difficult for taxi drivers to get into the centre of Glasgow, for example. And I understand all of that. But he understood it more because he wanted the city behind him. And he wanted to demonstrate that he was going to deliver. So the things that really struck me were that he asked his operations department, this is part of this ecoization of the city of Curitiba, and he said to his operations department, how long will it take to pedestrianise a street? And the director said, well, yeah, we could rush it through 6 months, maybe 3 months. And he said, I want it done in 48 hours. And did they do it in 48 hours? Yes, they did. And it was done over the weekend. On the Monday morning, people were sitting on benches, eating sandwiches. Children were not tethered to their parents. They were wandering freely. They were skipping and dancing and doing the things that children do. And people were coming from miles around because word spreads. All the neighbouring shopkeepers came and they said, oh, we want some of that. Look, people are spending more money. They're sitting around, they're looking at things in the shop windows. They're not in a rush. And that set off the largest pedestrianised precinct in the world. Then he went to the slum dwellers and he said, I want you to recycle 100% of your waste. But, that wouldn't be a very exciting proposition for people living in abject poverty, not knowing where the next meal is going to come from. But he said, I will give you food, I will give you transit tickets, and I will give you football tickets in exchange. And he said, yes. But he went further than that. He said, but I also want you to move to a part of the city where you're not subject to floods every year, and I want you to help to build your own homes. We will train you in construction. We will pay you. You will become employees. You'll be earning money and you get a brand new home at the end of it. And they loved that idea. Now 64% of the lowest income households are now working in the very lucrative construction industry. So he turned the city around, introduced the best public transport system. New York's transport system is used by less people with 8.5 million citizens. At that time, it was 1.2 million citizens in Curitiba. He did lots of things. He said to the fishermen, if you collect plastic, I will give you money in exchange. So off-season fishermen were able to go out and pick up plastic if the fishing stocks were down. So it was an amazing win-win for everyone. There was a protest, however. There was the idea of a cavalcade of cars coming into the city centre, drivers who just felt that, this could be a threat to them. And as they were driving in, they saw there were children sitting across the road, drawing pictures of the city they would like to live in. Isn't that genius? Because that is a way of, achieving something without, rattling any sabers, by making it something that has appeal to everyone. Anyway, the long and short of it is, he turned that city around. Its GDP went up, its average earnings went up, satisfaction of staying in the city for the rest of their lives was at 98%. That's extraordinary, isn't it? And all the other mayors said, how did you do that when you've got no more budget than I've got? And he said, take 1 off the budget and you've got creativity. Take 2 zeros off the budget, you've got genuine sustainability. But he says, you've got to beat off the complexity sellers first. Does that resonate with people? That's an extraordinary story because he's around. He's a man who's still alive, and he achieved this extraordinary turnaround in one city. It's a beautiful city, surrounded by parkland, with the sexiest transport system I've seen, honestly, anywhere. And he led that change because he was positive. He knew how to, he talks about it as like acupuncture. There are cities got acupoints, and you have to look at those pulse points that make or break the interaction between people. And he gave people what they wanted. And extraordinary. So that was the first story I told. And then I was sitting in a pub a week later in Edinburgh, and I heard this guy at the next table saying, and there's this guy called Jaime Lara, a mayor in Curitiba in Brazil, he starts telling the story. And he looks around and he said, "Oh, Jesus, I heard him telling that story last week. I'm so embarrassed." I said, "Don't be embarrassed. It's a great story. I want it spread because I want our politicians to see that there's a different way of approaching these big challenges. The language has to change. We have to focus on a positive vision. We have to use a language that is appealing to people. Who is ever going to say, 'Oh, we don't want a city designed for people'? No, that will never happen." So that story was the first I ever told. And it has had an amazing impact because it does say to people something about determination. It says something about leadership. It says something about reaching those people who people would say, "What about them?" Leaving them out. Typical politicians. You deny the poor, but he had dealt with all of that. And he's created a coherent city that's beautiful. Its transport systems work beautifully. And it has got, as I say, incredibly high resident satisfaction. I do not know anywhere in Britain that is that level of satisfaction. In fact, I don't think there's many places in the world that have got that level of satisfaction. And that shows you what can be done with leadership and creativity and looking at the sustainability of the city in the long term. So that was a great story. And in a sense, it is a bit Disney-like because he potentially faced a conflict, and there was a bit of a one with the motorists. But he knew he had to have a breakthrough that worked, that didn't rub people up the wrong way. So the way he presented it was imaginative. It was positive. It was, "We will make this happen. We will make this happen quickly." How refreshing is that? I'm 74 now, and I look at 20-year plans and I think, "Oh, Jesus, I'll never see it." Maybe I'm being unnecessarily negative. Maybe I will be around at 94. Who knows? But, there is something about timing. People don't want to be, part of a 30-year strategy when a lot of the things that need to be done can be done faster. So that's why that story made such an impact, particularly in the housing association sector that I was speaking to them. So this is the art of the story. And it has to have a positive conclusion. Otherwise, you're just making people miserable. And as we've seen with TV dramas, it completely takes a subject that people might have read in headlines in the papers. They haven't read the detail. They might talk about the post office scandal without knowing what it actually meant. And it goes on for years and years and years, headline after headline after headline, news item after news item after news item. And then when a drama comes out, everything changes because it shows the human story. And we are fascinated by human stories. We're fascinated by things that work, things that inspire, things that warn us of danger, of things that entertain us. That's why the story is such a powerful tool now. And it's really weird because if you'd said, a few years ago, "Oh, we've got a speech on Saturday night." Oh, right, okay. Don't fancy that. And now that's changed. People want to hear speakers. They want to hear people that can inspire, that can tell stories, that can show them that there's another alternative to the way that they're thinking and the way they're living their lives. And the only way you can do that really is storytelling. I don't talk in psychological speak because I'm not a psychologist. I can only talk from experience. So I know that resonates with people because it's real. It's like the whole peer mental health thing is really working. It's what people prefer. Where there are people around who are able to come and talk to you and buddy you and talk through the difficulty you're going through before it either escalates or it needs referred to someone more specialist. Terry, no problem. I'll see you later. Nice thing, also into a meeting. So that's the essence of stories. Now I'm going to ask you if you've got any questions or any comments on what I've been talking about, which is essentially the story has always been with us. It's suddenly got even more important because of the different kind of channels we've got, where people get 5-minute, 3-minute bursts on, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and it's back with a vengeance. And the greatest speakers tell stories, because that is how they make an impact with what they're trying to say, and it's also how people remember what they said. I've never remembered figures, never, unless it's something really, really striking. Figures just go out of my head. So, any comments or thoughts or requests for more of this kind of stuff? You can unmute. There's no one to ask me anything. Okay. That's fine. Did you enjoy it? Can you show that in some way? Good. Thank you very much. Yeah. Kept you spellbound. I love that. Thank you, Tian. So this is how I speak, right? So I thought, shall I do a PowerPoint? No, it's difficult, isn't it? I don't want to turn stories into a formula. Although there is a slight formula, it is something that we all know how to do. Because we do that when we're drunk in a pub. We tell stories. We do that when we're happy with friends. We tell stories. But as a leader, you can also tell stories. And, if you think about the kind of information that comes from leadership, which is so often about, new policies, new ways of doing things, new rules, or an urgent message that we need to do better. Wouldn't it be better to have engaged people so much earlier on in their passionate selves, the self that sees themselves being part of something that's bigger and better than them? So I'll finish with this story, and I've told it many times, but this is the power of an experience I had, which is in 1971. I was working in the construction sector, and every job was do this, do that, do it by this time. If you don't do it right, you've got a ton of bricks coming down at you. The old style of leadership. One day I was sent to a site in Earl's Court. This is down London, obviously. And I arrived, and this foreman with a soft hat and a broken nose put his arm around me and he says, "Welcome, Michael." And he took me and showed me the drawings, and he said, "This is the palace you're building." Do you know, I've never felt so exhilarated, so significant as I did that day. I was building a palace, and I was walking home that night, and I thought, I'm popping to the pub on my way home. And I went to all the guys I knew were sitting there with ties undone. They all worked in civil service. And what you so chirpy about? I says, "Guys, I'm building a palace." My eyes were bright. I was fit. I was healthy. I was excited. And that excitement never left me on that site. That is a powerful story, because it shows you that the way to get the best out of people is to make them feel part of something that's big and exciting. I saw myself as leaving a legacy in London. I saw myself as, building something that would shine brightly into the London skyline at night. And it was so different. So from that day on, that's how I approached my positions of leadership. If you can't make it exciting, you can't make it. It's that simple. A vision is something that really captures you. This wasn't the vision. This was his personal way of expressing it. We're building a palace. By the way, it wasn't a palace. The palace was a metaphor. There was this is something that's really important. It's someone's dream. And that worked for me. And I've told that story so many times. And it speaks volumes. You don't need to talk about leadership. You tell that story, and then you can go into discussion about what the implication of that style of leadership was compared with before. Well, I'll tell you the implication. 0 absenteeism, and it was finished ahead of time. That is very unusual in the building trade. So it worked. It had a massive impact. So for anyone in leadership, that story is very, very telling. And I think we're coming to an end now. Listen, I hope you've enjoyed that. And I hope you've got something from it. Yes, I agree, Margaret. Yes, I do talk about things that I've seen. I talk about the violence reduction unit, the most imaginative solution to a challenge. I talk about the advancements in renewables, loads of things. It's true. We need stories, yes. And again, if you want to talk about the advances we made since the advent of the Scottish Parliament, which devolved decision making to here, it's huge. It's huge. And there are so many stories, and I agree with you, Margaret. Thank you for mentioning that. It's true, because you could allow narratives to get out of hand. And I think that's happened around so many political debates. So, thank you very much. Any other comments? Oh, that's nice. I work in sustainability and may steal one about Curitiba. Brilliant, Georgina. Thank you so much. If even that is the outcome from today, I'm happy. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to be putting together a course based on all these. These are little testers just now. So if you enjoyed it, you might be interested in joining something which is a bit more joined up and goes through all the different elements, from how to use humour, how to use stories, how to pace, and how to put together a brilliant speech. So if you're interested, let us know. I will send notes out about what I've talked about today so that everyone receives them, right? So that it's not just the stories I told, it is the purpose of the story and why stories achieve so much penetration with audiences. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for coming. And I look forward to meeting up with you and, maybe finding out a bit more about what you do and how I can help you in any way. Of course, if you're looking for a speaker, don't hesitate to ask. Okay? Thank you very much. I bid you good night, but I'll stay around for a few minutes if anyone wants to talk. Okay? I'm free now. You can talk.
That was really helpful. Thank you, Mike. That was very entertaining. Good stories.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Did it make the point?
I think so, yes. Yeah, there were some powerful anecdotes in there as well. So, I've really enjoyed it.
That's brilliant, Georgina. Thank you. And I'm going to send out the notes from this as well, so you won't have to remember them.
Thank you.
Well, I think you probably will remember them. Thank you, Georgina.